Are you struggling with the CPA exam because your course failed to fit your learning style? I'm Darius Clark of I-75 CPA Review, where the right teacher makes all the difference. All right, let's look at the 1040, because the CPA exam will make sure that you know your way around an individual tax return. You won't have to memorize line numbers, but you will have to know the flow of an individual tax return. Of course, the names and the social security numbers are all fictitious for Phil and Shelley Strickland and their 4 kids. And while you won't have to memorize that wages go on line 1A, $80,000 here, you will need to know where wages comes from. What's the supporting documentation for wages? You'll have to know how to read Form W-2 and how those amounts flow to various places on the 1040. Because so many taxpayers receive a Form W-2. All employees receive Form W-2. So let's take a closer look at the form. And here would be that W-2 form. And you would have to know what flows over from this W-2 to the 1040 and what does not. And the exam would expect you to know that not only the $80,000 of wages on line 1 would go to the 1040, but what else? What about some of these other buckets like line 2, federal income tax withheld, or social security tax withheld, or Medicare tax withheld? How does that impact the 1040, or does it? What about state income tax and local income tax withheld on a W-2? Where do these items belong on a 1040? Well, maybe some of these don't transfer over at all, because maybe some of these aren't relevant to the 1040. So let's start with this W-2 form, and we can see that the gross wages on line 1 of $80,000 comes right over to the 1040, page 1. And there's that $80,000 of gross wages from Phil Strickland's W-2, and you'll have to know for the exam that gross wages goes on page 1 of 1040. And for many taxpayers, the gross wages on the W-2 form represents most, if not all, of their gross income on their tax return, especially if they are single or just starting out. So, W-2, very important on the exam. The gross wages go on page 1 of 1040, and that's because one of these taxpayers, Phil Strickland, is an employee of a company, and all employees we know receive a W-2. Here it is again. It's issued to him by his employer, Health Net Temps. It's got his name and his social security number on it. And then the wages are on box 1, and we bring that over to line 1 of the 1040. And while Phil Strickland received a W-2 from his employer, Shelley Strickland does not receive a W-2. Even though she worked this year, Shelley Strickland was self-employed. She owned her own business. So Shelley Strickland will fill out a Schedule C form for a small business owner. And let's go take a look at what a Schedule C looks like for Shelley Strickland, who owns her own business. And here's that business return, Schedule C, which gets attached to Form 1040 because Shelley Strickland is a self-employed personal trainer. And her gross income from the business, right here on line 1 of Schedule C, $140,000. But her bottom line net profit on Schedule C, down here on line 31, is $72,720. So what started out as $140,000 of gross income on Schedule C, by the time she has to pay tax on her earnings, her net profit, what's taxable from this business, is only $72,720, and that's because small business owners are allowed to deduct business-related expenses. So you'll have to know on the exam that although Shelley Strickland's gross was $140,000, she's not going to be taxed on that because she gets to deduct all these business expenses first, and then we determine her net profit or loss on the Schedule C, and it's the net profit that she's going to pay the tax on. Big difference between how a self-employed taxpayer pays their taxes versus an employee. So Shelley's self-employed, she's taxed on the net profit, whereas her husband Phil, he had a W-2 form. Phil was taxed on the gross wages of $80,000. there's no deductions available for him, even if he spent money related to his job. If he didn't get reimbursed by his employer, there's no place to deduct. Only the self-employed can deduct business-related expenses, and that's the purpose of Schedule C. So we said earlier that you need to know the flow of a 1040. How does this profit on Schedule C flow back to page 1 of the 1040? Does it go directly back to page 1 of 1040, or does it have to stop somewhere first? And as you can see, the profit on Schedule C flows to Schedule 1 of 1040, line 3, where it says business income or loss, attach Schedule C, and there it gets combined with some other items before it goes back to page 1 of 1040. Now, you're not going to have to memorize line numbers, but you are going to need to know that profit on Schedule C, or a loss, flows to Schedule 1 before it goes back to 1040. What other items go on Schedule 1, Part 1 here, where it says additional income? We could see line 5 where it says rental real estate. So if they have a real estate rental property and there's a profit or a loss, that would go on Schedule 1. Also, any partnerships, S-corps, if they had a K-1 from any of those type of entities, that would show up. On line 8, if they had gambling winnings, that would be included here. Also, what about on line 8C, cancellation of debt? That would also be income that would combine with all these, and you'd have a total at the bottom of Schedule 1 to then bring back to Form 1040, page 1. So look at the $73,948 total here. Let's go back to page 1 of 1040 and find where that Schedule 1 total goes. Now we're back on 1040, page 1, and you can see that on line 8 of 1040, page 1, it says additional income from Schedule 1. So you can see on Form 1040, there's not a lot of room for details. So that's why you need Schedule 1. Because if you want to know why someone has additional income of $73,948, you'd have to look at Schedule 1 to see the specifics. So on the exam, they're very likely to give you what's called a document review sim, where they'll give you the W-2 in an exhibit, they'll give you the Schedule C information in an exhibit, and they'll ask you to summarize and where does everything flow. And you'll have to know that the gross wages on W-2 go directly to 1040. There's the $80,000 from Phil Strickland's W-2. But the profit on the Schedule C for Shelley, that doesn't go directly from Schedule C to page 1. Instead, it stops on Schedule 1. And in that document review sim on the exam, you'll have to know that Schedule 1 is very important for things like unemployment compensation. If your client is unemployed and receives compensation, that's where it goes, Schedule 1. Gambling winnings would also go on Schedule 1. Cancellation of debt. And all these items will be combined with the profit on Schedule C and the rental real estate income. So you'll probably get a sim like that where you'll need to know what gets combined on Schedule 1 and what doesn't. We know so far that the W-2 would not go on Schedule 1, but instead the W-2 would go directly to 1040, page 1. Let's notice that most of the income for the Stricklands this year consists of Phil's W-2, $80,000, and Shelley's profit on Schedule C, plus a little bit of rental income. How do we know? Because if you look at line 9 where it says total income, $171,575, what is that? Well, it's mostly her profit, the little bit of rent income, and his W-2. So line 9 here, total income, another term for that is gross income. So gross income, total income, that's $171,575. And this will be a good time to point out that gross income on line 9 is not the same as adjusted gross income on line 11 of $141,337. And the exam will expect that you know how that $171,000 of gross income on line 9 became $141,000 of adjusted gross income on line 11. Well, the first page of the 1040 doesn't have all that detail. All we can see on line 10 is that there's a difference of $30,238 between the total gross income and the adjusted gross income. So to see what actually happened and why they were able to deduct $30,238 from their gross income to arrive at AGI, or adjusted gross income, we're going to have to go back to our old friend Schedule 1. While Schedule 1 Part 1 was our additional income, where we had Shelley's profit on the business and the rent income, there's also a Schedule 1 Part 2. And here are the details as to how they were able to deduct from gross income to arrive at AGI, $30,238. And we can see that Part 2 of Schedule 1 says adjustments to income, and we know how this ends, $30,238. And as for these individual items that get deducted, we will see those close up in a different video. One of the things that stands out is on line 21, there's a student loan interest deduction of $1,600. There's an IRA deduction on line 20 of $6,500. And there's a self-employed retirement plan deduction on line 16 of $17,000. And that's because Shelley's self-employed, so she has what's called a SEP plan, or a simple plan. But Phil, he works for a company. And if he doesn't have a retirement plan at work, he's going to take his own IRA deduction of $6,500. And if we combine all of these items, we can see that $30,238 is the total adjustments to gross income to arrive at AGI. So these deductions will come back over to page 1 of 1040. And now that we're back on page 1 of 1040, we can go down to line 10 and see the total of $30,238 with no details. It just says adjustments to income from Schedule 1, line 26. With the purpose being that the gross income of $171,575 is not the same as the AGI of $141,337. Why? Because of these deductions to arrive at AGI that we found on Schedule 1, Part 2. So if the exam gives you a sim with a lot of supporting documentation, they'll tell you about things like student loan interest and IRA contributions, and you'll have to know that they go on Schedule 1. And here we are back on Schedule 1, Part 2, and you can see that the IRA deduction and the student loan interest deduction are both adjustments to income to arrive at AGI. They're deductible on Schedule 1, Part 2. You won't have to know the line numbers, but you'll have to know where something's deducted. And in a different video, we will go over each one of these adjustments to arrive at AGI and how you get the limits for them, if there are any limits. Let's go back to page 1 of 1040. So we said the flow of a 1040, very important. For example, the total gross income on line 9, $171,575, but the AGI, $141,337. And then look at the taxable income all the way down on line 15, $103,275. What started out as gross income of $171,000 is down to $103,000 of taxable income. So while AGI on line 11 is a very important subtotal, we don't pay taxes on AGI. We pay tax on taxable income of $103,275. So think of AGI as the first stop on the way from gross income all the way down to taxable income. What started out as gross income of $171,575 is down to $103,275 by the time we have to pay taxes. And the reason between $171,000 of gross income and $103,000 of taxable income, the reason is allowable deductions. So not only is there a big difference between gross income on line 9 and AGI on line 11, there's also a big difference between AGI on line 11 and taxable income on line 15. This is the end of the first video on overview of a 1040, and by the time we finish all 3 videos, you'll be able to explain to the examiner how total income of $171,575 became AGI of $141,337 and then became taxable income of $103,275.